Welcome, everyone. Welcome back to the show. Hit that like button as you come on. That helps boost the stream in YouTube's algorithm. It's your host, Danny Dhaiphong. We have a big show today with three very special guests, and we're going to talk about this coup. What I'm arguing is that Europe has taken the reins as chief attack dog for the U.S. NATO war on Russia, and the escalations are evidently ramping up. The EU has gone full scale with its militarization, or whatever full scale it can, and is finally turning the spigot off, supposedly, to Russian gas, something they've claimed they would have done back in 2022 and beyond. Ukrainian intelligence is also saying that Russia is preparing for war with NATO, and it isn't wrong, but the nature of the war is this. NATO and Europe are already at war with Russia, and Vladimir Putin and the Russian government are preparing for its most devastating phase yet. To talk about this and so much more, I have three very special guests. First, I have Larry Johnson, former CIA analyst, a geopolitical commentator. Larry, good to see you.
Hey, Danny.
Great. Then I also have Patrick Henningsen. He is a journalist and a geopolitical commentator in his own right for 21st Century Wire. Patrick, good to see you.
Great to be with you, Danny.
And for the first time, I have Thomas Fazi. He is a journalist, geopolitical commentator, author. He writes for his own Substack, as does Patrick. Gentlemen, good to see you. Thomas, good to see you.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks, Danny.
Of course, of course. So I wanted to get to this. I've been making this argument of late, and I think it's coming to a head that Europe, the European Union in particular, but we should throw in the UK as well, has essentially undergone over the years a coup, which is essentially US led. And I want to play some comments that Kaja Kallas, the VP of the EU Commission, recently said as Europe essentially prepares for war with Russia. And here is the first of her comments.
We see President Trump's efforts to bring peace to Ukraine. Of course, all these efforts are welcome, but we don't see Russia really wanting peace. Russia only understands strength and only negotiates when it's really put to negotiate.
So Russia only negotiates when it is put to negotiate. And then here is Kaja Kallas again. And I want to emphasize that this all comes in response to a potential Budapest summit between Trump and Putin, as well as comments Trump made about possible concessions Ukraine will have to give up if there's any kind of settlement to the conflict. Here she goes again.
What we must not forget is that Russia is the aggressor and Ukraine is the victim here. So putting the pressure on Ukraine as the victim is not the right approach. And not only for Ukraine, but also for European security and the global security. Because if aggression pays off, it serves as an invitation to use it elsewhere.
So the interesting thing here, gentlemen, is that the EU Commission Vice President is saying that essentially Russia has to be put to negotiate, meaning forced to negotiate, and then at the same time saying that aggression should not be rewarded. But there are major elements of the U.S. and European national security state apparatus that are talking about Europe being at war here. So here is that. I want to put this up now. And this is interesting because it comes from Michael Kilmage of the Kennan Institute, and I'll show you where the Kennan Institute falls. But essentially, gentlemen, this is arguing that Europe should ramp up war because it has so many advantages over a belligerent Russia that a war of attrition cannot stop Europe if Europe gets more involved in a war with Russia, and that its economic might is so overwhelming that no war that Russia could wage on Europe would decimate it. Now, I want to start with you, Larry, on this, because the Kennan Institute, if we just look at what the Kennan Institute is here, we see that the partner foundations of the Kennan Institute, the first one is the Department of State. And so talk about this dynamic that's going on, Larry, as the peace talks that have yet to come, and the situation in Ukraine continues to escalate, Europe getting more and more ramping up with war. Your thoughts?
Well, let's do the breaking news. There aren't going to be any talks. Okay, it was announced about an hour ago that the U.S. has called off the talks, and it's real simple. I mean, good God, this is. I told Judge Napolitano, somebody needs to hire an audiologist. You know, the doctors that specialize in hearing loss, and or somebody deals with reading comprehension, because clearly the Trump administration has not listened to a single word that the Russians have said since June 14th of 2024. So, you know, here we are, what, July, August, September, October. So 16 months later, the Russians, surprise, 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 have not changed their position. Their position is very clear. The 5 territories that are now part of the Russian Federation, according to the Russian Constitution, that means Crimea, Zaporizhia, Kherson, Donetsk, Luhansk. Those 5 are permanently part of Russia. There are no concessions to be made by Putin. He's not going to call a ceasefire in place. The Ukrainians do not get to keep that territory. That is Russia's. And Russia is either going to secure it via negotiations, or they're going to finish taking it militarily, regardless of what the West says. That's number one. Number two, all Ukrainian troops are out of Russian territory, and NATO is out of Ukraine. Again, Russia has not changed that position. Russia said, once those conditions are taken care of, we're happy to negotiate about the long-term issues at stake, which is very simple. No NATO. NATO must pull back because Russia's not going to live at the end of a loaded gun. And that's the position. And now they're acting like, oh, this is really outrageous. Russia's got this tough position. Yeah, they've had it all along. They've been very clear. They have not stuttered. They haven't done hand signals or like news for the deaf. They've written it. They've said it repeatedly. And Trump and his team just seem incapable of paying attention. So this is more what I call diplomatic performance art on the part of Trump. You know, they raise expectations. Oh, we're going to have this big meeting. And look, the Russians, I know this week after I've had a discussion with 3 Russian, 2 generals, 1 colonel. One of them was Abdi Aludinov, the hero of Kursk. With 4 members of the Duma, with a former prime minister of Ukraine, who was the prime minister, Azarov, who was the prime minister from 2010 to 2014. Everybody's on the same page of music, and we'll get to, you know, later when you're ready, all this crap, this nonsense about, oh, gas shortages in Ukraine. Yeah, I wish there was a gas shortage. Otherwise, I wouldn't have been caught in traffic for an hour and a half trying to go 10 miles across town. And as the guy who was driving me said, he says, just like New York. I go, worse. There's no gas shortage at all.
Well, Thomas, I want to go to you because you are joining from one of the heartlands of Europe. I wanted to ask you, how have you traced this kind of transformation of Europe essentially into a U.S. NATO attack dog? And how do you react to the moves now by Kaja Kallas in the EU to try to thwart what Larry already is saying is not even going to happen, which is U.S.-Russia peace talks?
Yeah. Well, I mean, if this is a coup, as you call it, it's one of the longest coups in history, because it's a coup that's been ongoing for a very long time. I think we can trace it back at least to the Second World War and the post-war architecture that followed, which which was created a very clear hierarchy of power within the so-called collective West, with the US on top and European powers below in a very clear subordinate position. Some of the major power in Europe at the time, and still today, Germany, obviously as a result of having lost a war, was placed under de facto military occupation by the US, and to this day still hosts thousands of US forces. The same goes for my country, Italy. And these countries host dozens of critical US bases. So almost a century after the end of World War II, and despite all the talk of NATO being an alliance among equals, clearly that's not the case. NATO has always had a very clear role, which was defined as by NATO's first Secretary General as that of keeping the Russians out, the Americans in, and the Germans down. And I think it's played that role, throughout the entire post-war period, and it still plays that role up to this day. I think we often underestimate the extent of U.S. control over Europe, which, I mean, the troops that are stationed, the U.S. troops that are stationed in Europe are just the most manifest example of that. But of course, U.S. control extends to pretty much every other area of European policy. Of course, the U.S. Has enjoyed since World War II extensive linkages with the U.S. with the European defense and security establishment. Let's not forget that in Germany, that also involved, in fact, recycling a good part of the Nazi power structure into what was the West German defense structure, and then the NATO defense structure. The same thing happened in Italy, and I think when we consider that, for example, Germany's intelligence service, the BND, was essentially an outgrowth of the Gehlen organization, which was this essentially intelligence organization of former Nazis led by Reinhard Gehlen, which was one of Hitler's top intelligence officers. This formed the backbone of what then became the Germany's intelligence services, and there are countless other examples of this kind. And then we have, of course, the control of the information ecosystem. Pretty much, the lingua franca in Europe continues to be English, and the infosphere is controlled by U.S. think tanks, by largely Anglo media. So we can see this influence playing out across the board, and I think we see that today. And then you mentioned the European Union, which was supposed to be a counterbalance to U.S. power, or at least this was the narrative. Of course, we know that it was never meant to be that. It was always meant to be a tool of U.S. control, and we see that clearly today more than ever. The European Union, including in its earlier incarnations, before it was even called the European Union, was always went hand in hand with NATO, and we see that today. The EU has essentially become one with NATO, but that was always the plan. And so when you put all these elements together, it's not surprising to see that now that push is coming to shove for the US empire, and now that it is more crucial than ever for the US to maintain absolute control over its client states, over the periphery, first and foremost Europe. We are seeing a Europe that is more vassalized to the US than ever before. This is simply the inevitable consequence of what has been happening essentially since World War II. Europe is today more controlled than it's ever been by the US. And so I think what is happening shouldn't be, there's no Europe-US rift as the mainstream narrative would have us believe. It's simply the transatlantic establishment that is doing what it does, and what role Trump plays in all this is ultimately of secondary importance. Whether he generally wants to bring peace to Ukraine and is unable to do so, or whether that was just a ruse, ultimately it's of secondary importance. What matters is what we're seeing, and that's the fact that the U.S. and the transatlantic establishment more in general cannot bring itself to make peace with Russia, because it's essentially we've been at war with Russia for over a century, and an election doesn't change that. And ultimately, just to conclude, it's not just about territorial concessions. What Larry said is all perfectly true, but we know that from Russia's perspective, is the territorial concessions just one aspect of the deal. Russia wants a wider reorganization of the international architecture, which makes proxy wars such as the one that has been happening in Ukraine for years now impossible. And that means redefining the balance of power and redefining a new international architecture, which, where the US's hegemonic role is vastly reduced. And this is something that the US elites and the transatlantic elites simply are unable to accept.
Mm. Yeah, well, Patrick, to you, I wanted to ask you then, given everything that both Thomas and Larry said, is Europe at war with Russia? And what are the consequences? Because they're talking about shutting off the gas again, and this time by 2028, working Russian gas to Europe. What are the consequences here? Because it seems like it all has been backfiring, will continue to.
Well, I think the consequences are pretty well documented by now. I mean, mainly the economic consequences are pretty obvious. We can look at countries like Germany. I just had a discussion on our other program about this earlier this week, and there's no argument about the damage that's been incurred by Germany, first and foremost, as a result of sanctions and also the sabotage of the Nord Stream pipeline. And yet, this doesn't somehow get factored into the political conversation. Definitely not in Britain, and ditto probably in Europe. And so this is like paramount. This is like central to the discussion. If you're talking about is it worth it or not, or what's the benefit for European countries to escalate this proxy war in Ukraine, or just cut their losses and just be happy with a new Maginot Line that extends down from Kaliningrad right down to the Black Sea. I mean, why would you want to do any more than that? Because the risks, of course, are great. If you're talking about look at what happened with the whole drone farrago. Okay, that very similar to another similar type of incident 2 years ago, where an anti-aircraft missile, whatever, landed in Polish territory, and they said, "Oh, it's a Russian missile," and it turned out it was a errant Ukrainian misfire or whatever, and it nearly led. They were screaming Article 5, and they were just not so much screaming Article 5 this time with the drone farrago, the Russian drone attack that wasn't, but they still incorporate it into all of their analysis. So it's almost like this thing was planned, and this was just going to be a talking point, and it was going to be used as basically a stepping stone towards a broader policy change, more aggressive, more escalation. So they're kind of locked into it. And I think Thomas made a good point about this being U.S.-led policy. The whole point of politicians, it seems, isn't that any particular politician in the U.S. or within NATO's sphere at the moment can change the policy of a Russian encirclement and full militarization of Europe, and just increasing escalation and aggression between East and West. The only question between politicians is how fast they're going to accelerate that process. It's either going to go slow with some politicians or really fast with others. And it was interesting when Zelensky visited Washington recently. I think there was a leak to the press that Trump had given the little guy a good spanking, but had done it in private. And so, but then that was leaked, and then people were speculating, whether that was leaked to make Trump look bad. But personally, it was probably leaked by somebody that wanted to let the Europeans know that Trump somehow wasn't on the page, and then get them to double down their efforts to get this war back on track. Or all of this is choreographed on both sides between Washington and Europe. I don't know but what matters is the facts on the ground. So it's just I don't. How can anyone believe or even care anything that Donald Trump says? Anything. He's flip-flopped constantly. He's flip-flopped on the tomahawks. He's flip-flopped on his being upset or angry with Russia, and then he says, no, Ukraine's never going to win this, or he says, well, Ukraine could lose, but they could win as well. And he's constantly all over the place. And he's got this rotating doghouse. Putin's in the doghouse this week. Next week, Zelensky's in the doghouse. Next week, Putin's back in the doghouse. So there's nothing substantial happening. Honestly, the Alaska and whatever the next theatrical performance is going to be, whether it's in Budapest or whatever, nothing's going to happen, because for this, all you have to do is listen to the U.S. team. They can't articulate anything of substance. They won't admit how we got here in the first place. They won't tell the truth on that story. And then they're not going to basically outline the true Russian position. What they do, and they're doing this with the Middle East as well. They did this in Sharm el-Sheikh with the 20-point plan. They just present, they march up, make the phone call. Trump tells his people, get them there, get Sisi there, get everybody there. And we're going to unveil our plan, our peace plan. They never consult anybody. They show up with this pro forma plan, and everybody has to accept it or submit or die, basically. This is like where the United States is at right now. And the thing that's most horrifying to me is that there's not a damn Democrat that'll push back against any of this. If this was a football match, the goal's like totally open. You could just be scoring nonstop, but nobody wants to do it. And that's the thing that for me is so frustrating and baffles me, that for all the hate that Trump got for the last 10 years, if you really wanted to take him down, there's more than a few opportunities to do it on just about every aspect of all of this.
Yeah, I remember going to, I didn't go to the second No Kings protest or whatever it was called, but I remember going to observe the first one. I don't even know if it was called No Kings, but not a word about NATO, Russia, war, Gaza, anything except defending NATO. So that was a great quality.
Oh, really? That was it. That was a problem.
Yeah. That was one of the points, was defending NATO from Russia. Shows how in touch they are. But Larry, any reactions you want to this? Because I want to ask you, are we looking at the character of Europe, as Thomas and Patrick, you have illuminated, is still bearing out right now, and Russia has been warning that even that countries like Poland are likely going to maybe attack Russia. There's all kinds of talks. You have the highest EU level officials saying that Russia has to be forced to negotiate. Is there a push then to have Europe be kind of the battering ram and end up in an actual shooting war with Russia? And what would that exactly mean? It seems disastrous and almost impossible.
Calling Europe a battering ram is like calling a 90-year-old man with erectile dysfunction a stud. Okay. Nothing. It's rather limp in that regard, Okay.
Definitely noted. Yes.
Thomas, just are you in the UK?
I'm in Rome.
Oh, thank God. Because with the way you were talking, if you're in the UK, they'd come arrest your ass for harsh speech. So yeah, hunker down, my friend. You're in good shape. No, look, Patrick and Thomas summed it up nicely. I've referred to the wedding at Sharm el-Sheikh, where Donald Trump showed up with all the family members of the bride and groom assembled behind. You had all the Europeans, and then you had the Gulf Arabs, and there was Erdogan, president of Indonesia, and Trump performed a wedding. Only one little problem: no bride and no groom. Okay, there were no Palestinians, there were no Israelis. And, the last time we really had a meaningful agreement was between Anwar Sadat and Yitzhak Rabin, with Clinton presiding over that. And we all know how that ended, with both of those gentlemen being assassinated. So the notion that Europe is playing any kind of constructive role anywhere in the world is a joke. And I don't mean to insult our European viewers or friends that are watching, but if anything, the so-called leadership, political leadership, particularly in United Kingdom, France, and Germany, are just they take ineptitude to new lows, and are unable. They can talk a big game, but they can't deliver anything. What they field any hypersonic missiles? No. Can they produce enough artillery to keep Ukraine able to fire and match what Russia's shooting? No. Do they have any extra stockpile of missiles by their short range or medium range that they could pony up? Germany's the only one with some Taurus, and they are rightly scared to death to even trot those out, because doing so will lead to an attack, a response, a retaliatory response by Russia on Germany. Russia is not going to screw around and make threats. They put Germany on notice with respect to that. So, Europe is an irrelevancy. There was a time when they were relevant during the colonial empire, and with I think as Thomas noted at the end of World War II, they were forced into subservient to the United States, but still got to pretend. They got to do dress up. They could put on the military uniforms or the political leader uniform and march around like children do when they play cowboy and Indian or doctor or whatever. But in terms of actually being able to do something, the Brits learned that when was it, 55, 54, when they launched, along with Israel, the attack on the Suez Canal, and Eisenhower told them, "Get the hell out," and they left. They didn't have the wherewithal to stay there, and they were much grander in terms of military capability back then. So it's just the Europeans, they're spectators with good seats.
Mm. Yeah, same question to you, Thomas. Before we move on to a different segment, what's your reaction? Are we looking at Europe becoming kind of the arm of a U.S.-led war with Russia, or is Larry right that Europe just does not have an arm and a leg or anything? I won't get into the expletives that Larry said earlier, but not really anything else.
I didn't say expletives. I said erectile dysfunction.
To swing, to kind of swing on Russia in that way. Your thoughts, Thomas? Oh, sorry, you're muted. Hold on. I unmuted you.
Yeah, no, it's pretty clear that this is the US's plan for the short term. Just hand over the continuation of the proxy war to Europe. Obviously, Europe doesn't have the means to turn the proxy war around, i.e., to guarantee a military victory to Ukraine. I think even kids understand this at the moment, and now it's even mainstream voices are starting to say, we've been saying it for, well, it was clear since day one, which is why this proxy war is such a tragedy, because Ukraine never had a chance of winning a military victory against Russia, or retaking those the captured territories. Even less so does it have the means to do that today. This is pretty clear. Even Field Marshal Lord Richards, who's one of the highest ranking men in the British military, recently said that. He said there's no way Ukraine can win this war. So, but of course, the aim is not necessarily to win this war, whatever that would mean. I mean, what does that mean? Recapturing all the territories, including Crimea? I mean, no one believes that to be a realistic possibility, even though that's still the official Ukrainian position, and even European position, basically, retaking all the territories, and that's clearly not a realistic option. So, but of course, and now that the US is kind of pulling out from that, directly supplying Ukraine is in even direr straits, of course. So at best, the European Union or Europe more in general can keep the proxy war simmering on for a little longer. They can keep the war of attrition going for a little longer by buying US weapons, and of course the US military industrial complex is fine with that, and I'm sure Trump is fine with that too. So Ukrainians are going to keep dying in this unwinnable war. They're going to keep this war of attrition going. I don't think there really is no long-term strategy or even medium-term strategy, I would say. And so the question becomes, why are they doing this? So, of course, partly, as we were saying, they're doing this largely under directions from Washington, not necessarily the White House, but the deeper structures of the U.S. security state, the national security state, the defense establishment. I think that a lot of these European so-called politicians were essentially bred by the U.S. security establishment, especially in the Baltics and in Eastern Europe, the so-called New Europe. These people were bred by the U.S. Defense establishment, and so it's perfectly reasonable to assume that they're still taking directions from that establishment. So they're not acting in a totally autonomous way, if at all. Now, of course, I think there are also domestic considerations, for Europe's proxy politicians. They've invested so much in this war, not just economically, and that, and the price that people have paid that European citizens have paid for this war has been already emphasized by Patrick, and so of course they can't just turn around and say, sorry, we messed up, we can't win this war. So there's that element, which, so in a way that gives this war a kind of just forward momentum, because they just don't know how, even if they wanted to get out of it, they don't know how to do that. But I think more in simply in political terms, the loss in terms of political capital. I mean, European elites aren't doing that well in terms of legitimacy and consensus and popular support as it is. This could be, the nail in the coffin for them. And I think more in general, it's clear that for the European political establishment, they need the Russian bogeyman, because that's what is justifying all these crackdowns on democracy, all these crackdowns on free speech, on people's civil liberties. It's all done, as a response to, Russian threats, Russian interference. This is what justifies all these anti-democratic policies, including, heavily interfering in elections or outright canceling elections, as we saw in Romania. So the blanket justification for all these measures, which they must resort to remain in power, because if they allow the democratic process to play out normally, they would be kicked out of office tomorrow. So they need to keep, they need to resort to increasing authoritarian measures just to stay in power, and they need, the Russian threat to do that. If Europe were to make peace with Russia tomorrow, that how would they justify all this? They wouldn't be able to justify all these measures anymore. And I think, just even more in general, this, what Russia has become the sole, rationale, the sole raison d'etre for the European Union. I mean, that's all, this supposedly, this union supposedly, founded on peace and and on bringing peace to the continent, now has its only reason for existing in this sort of low simmering conflict with Russia. And so, I think the European Union wouldn't last very long if we were to make peace with Russia. This is the only kind of glue that's keeping this, really rotten structure together. And so, so I think the question is, partly they're operating, I think, under the assumption that they can do whatever they want to. They can keep escalating, the narrative, the rhetoric, and even the kind of direct attacks on Russia. Let's not forget that every Ukrainian strike in Russian territory is done with Western logistical and military and satellite support. So every attack. So we are effectively at war with Russia. I mean, of course, that's not rhetoric. I mean, that's finally where people are starting to say the truth, because for until very recently it was, oh no, we're not at war with Russia, it's Ukraine that's at war with Russia. Now now it's out in the open, which in a way is a good thing, but it's also scary, because what does that mean? So I think partly they're operating under the assumption that Russia is never going to respond to these threats, and that's, I think, a very dangerous, naive assumption. I think maybe on some level, they really do desire war with Russia. But of course, that brings this discussion beyond the political plane into a, psychiatric plane. We're talking about, literally, clinically, psychopathic policies. If that is the case, but I wouldn't rule that out. I think there is a psychiatric element to this. I think on some level, European elites are clinically going crazy, have already gone crazy. And I think that we've seen that happen before in history. It's not, there are a lot of rational explanations that, for why this is happening, but I think, at some point, Europe has a tendency to step beyond that into the irrational. And that's usually when things get very, very messy. And I think that's the direction we're heading in.
Yeah, and that brings me to a follow-up segment here, and I'll begin with you, Patrick. Russia itself is saying that Europe is preparing for a bigger conflict with Russia. This came from Sergei Nareshkin, the head of the Foreign Intelligence Services in Russia, saying that Russophobia and militarization is all that the European Union have to offer. Now, Ukrainian intelligence is saying the opposite. They're saying that Russia is preparing for war with NATO by 2030, and that this should essentially raise the red alert for Europe and to step up their support. So are we going to see a war, Patrick, between Europe and Russia? Is this where the Ukraine conflict is naturally heading to, as the facts on the ground in the Ukraine conflict turn worse and worse and worse for Ukraine and for all of its backers? Oh, sorry, you're muted. Hold on. Continue. Sorry.
I think that can be factual, Danny. That absolutely, Europe is preparing for war with Russia, and certainly Russia is preparing for a war with Europe. The question is, which of those two sides is capable and willing to fight such a war? That's the big question, you see. And I don't think there's any will on the European side to actually fight. I don't think there is. Europe feels so less strongly about the cause, and NATO does, that they're not willing to sacrifice anybody, but they're more than happy to chuck the entirety of Ukraine into their meat grinder in order to sort of placate and satisfy and satiate their collective ego. For their existential collective ego for NATO and for the European Union. Russia is preparing, but it's doing so because, unlike Europe, Russia is being encircled by NATO, and they're being provoked, and NATO is basically overthrowing governments on their periphery, countries like Georgia, like Ukraine, like Moldova, that have been in the Russian sphere, economic and political sphere of influence and cooperation for many years. They're also doing the same thing with Azerbaijan, a former CIS country, or a CIS country, former Soviet a satellite state. And so for Russia, it is an existential issue. It is an existential threat. So yeah, they are both preparing. I think for the problem is, like, when you talk to, Thomas is a journalist, talks to a lot of people. Larry talks to people. I also talk to people. I make a point to talk to people who are active duty or retired U.S. military. Same with British. And if I can, I'll speak to European military as well. And I normally, when I talk to them, I want to get a temperature check on where they are on the information, what they're being told is happening on the ground, and like where they are politically. In terms of what they think the political situation in Russia is. And overwhelmingly, the British, almost to a man, everybody I've spoke to in the last 12 months believes the following: that the Russian economy is on the verge of collapse, that the Russian army is on the verge of collapse, that Russia is conscripting 60-year-old men to fight on the front, and Russia has lost 1 million plus men, and Ukraine hasn't lost that much. So believe it or not, this is what's informing the military hierarchy in this country and in Britain. And then they're informing the political class, you see. And then the political class is informing the mainstream media and the defense reviews that are coming out of the MOD and so forth, that is feeding into that as well. So what they're doing, and so all the policy projections and all the plans and all the ambitions, and Mark Rutte in his nice suit marching around with Pete Hegseth at the last NATO summit, these people are being incentivized to basically run with the lies, run with the propaganda, run with the disinformation. They're being incentivized to present an inverted narrative to what's actually happening. I cannot stress what a recipe for disaster this has been historically, and many people would rightly or wrongly point to phenomenons like this that caused the collapse of many great former empires or the Soviet Union, etc. Anybody who's on the losing end of a major war. This is usually a symptom, basically, is everybody believes things that simply are not true, and they're being incentivized to run with those narratives. So everything's being built on top of that. That is definitely the case in Europe. And that way, everybody in the political world has got their ass covered, because they can say, well, it's in Der Spiegel. It's what the Times are saying. This is what the BBC have said. This is what's in the New York Times. So like, we're just, it can't, and everybody can't be wrong at once. But in the case of this war, they are. And that's one of the main problems with all of this. And so I think I think it's going to be a bad ending eventually for NATO, for the West. And the biggest risk here is they will, like European elites did before the First and Second World War, they will double down. They will double down on their reputations. They'll double down on their political legacies, and they might very well tempt the possibility of a major conflagration with another great power. And it's always a risk. It's always a risk. I know people don't care at this point after 3 years into this Ukrainian debacle. That can't possibly happen. And in fact, Americans are wagering on the fact that Russia is constantly bluffing, you see. And that's all predicated on the same misinformation and the disinformation that I was explaining before. Russia is bluffing because Russia doesn't have any red lines, and because Russia must be weak because they haven't, quote, won the war after 3 years, and they haven't gained much territory. Just look at the map. They just got a few little regions in the Donbass and da. But so what they're telling you is they don't know what Russia's actual objectives are, politically and militarily and national security wise. That's what the Western leaders and the press and the politicians are basically admitting without admitting it, is they have no idea what Russia's program is. But if you study the Russian side, you know what the program is, and it's the same as it's been since the beginning of this crisis. They haven't changed hardly anything. So it's not like, you need a PhD in political science to work it out. You just have to listen and observe. And when another great nuclear power is putting something down, you have to take it seriously and note it. But that's not happening, you see. And people like Lindsey Graham and these other people, like the only language Vladimir Putin knows is force. So we need to double down on the force. And Pete Hegg says, Donald Trump taught us that peace through strength is the only thing that works, kind of thing. It's just so embarrassing at this point, the whole pantomime that the Trump administration has descended into. It's like if you told me 4 years ago, Pat, in 2025, we're going to put Fox News in charge of the U.S. government. We're going to put Pete Hegseth as defense secretary. We're going to put Tammy Bruce, head of the State Department, and I'd be like, that's going to be a disaster. And I'd look around the room and say, raise your hand if you think that's going to be a disaster. Everybody's going to raise their hand. Where are we right now? We're there.
Yeah.
We're there.
Yeah, we are there. We are there. And Larry, to Patrick's point too, it's interesting how they all speak the same. He brought up Lindsey Graham, forces of the U.S. national security state. Well, Europe is speaking very similarly, forcing Russia into peace and telling Trump, Trump is saying now, let's freeze the conflict lines in Ukraine. And Europe is like, yeah, let's do that. But no concessions for Ukraine. Ukraine can't give any concessions if that happens. And then you have, Larry, Sergei Lavrov. I'll just play this really quickly, just reiterating everything that Patrick just said about what Russia has been saying this whole time. It almost feels like they're wasting time towards some kind of war. Here is what Sergei Lavrov had to say in just a few seconds.
Repeat once again, the immediate ceasefire is something that they started to raise, unlike the need to address the crux of the matter and to eliminate the root causes. A ceasefire in this context would mean only one thing. That means that the main part of Ukraine would be still controlled by the Nazi regime, and in this part of Ukraine, it will be the only place on earth that would ban the language in legal terms, let alone the fact that it is an official UN language and the language used by the majority of the population.
So, no ceasefire, Larry. And that is what essentially both Europe and the US are now demanding of Russia.
Well, Patrick couldn't hear me wildly applauding his remarks. However, he got one thing wrong. Tammy Bruce is no longer at State Department. She's on her way to be ambassador, what, Outer Mongolia, or, you know, or maybe that new country that Trump created, Azerbaijan, you know. So, no, look, the Patrick was so spot on with the recitation of the narrative, and it would be one thing if it was just a small group of people that believed that. You know, it'd be like me telling you, Danny, hey, Danny, if you attach these two pillows to your arm and flap real hard and jump off the 50-story building I'm in, you'll have a soft landing. Now, if you were dumb enough to believe that and you acted on it, you would pay the consequences, which would mean you would not fly again. And so the fact that the West is making those same sort of crazy assumptions is dangerous. You know, I have talked, you know, I was with Abdi Aludinov the other night. So Abdi he fought in the Second Chechen War. He lost several family members. He's Muslim. He is a patriot of Russia. And he led the operation in which they entered a gas line that was about 15 kilometers, I think, east of Suja in Kursk region. Now, I'd like you to go out tomorrow, bend over at the waist or squat down and walk 15 kilometers. See if you can make it. That's what those Russians did. I mean, they went 15 kilometers underground in a hunched over in the most difficult conditions you can imagine, popped up on the other side and began shooting, you know, it was like a turkey shoot with Ukrainians. Killed them all or captured some. That's not what you call a weak army. And in fact, Abdi, he explained that at one point he was pulled back from the front to a headquarters unit, and where they were asking, okay, tell us what's going on at the front, what's really happening. And so he told them what was good, what was bad, what the inadequacies were. And just as an example, yeah, man, we're getting really hammered by those drones. Our drones are getting intercepted with electronic warfare. What can we do? How about fiber optic drones? Russia came up with that within 4 to 6 weeks. The United States Army couldn't do that in a year and a half. These guys did it within 4 to 6 weeks. They're reacting immediately to what they see on the battlefield. They've exchanged bodies since January, where dead Ukrainians are returned to Ukraine, dead Russian soldiers are returned to Russia. The average rate of exchange is that for every dead Russian, there's a minimum of 30 dead Ukrainians. In some cases, it's been 50 dead, 1 to 30, 1 to 50. Now, the same clowns in the West, the generals Petraeus, Hodges, Keynes, Admiral Readies, you hear them say, well, Russia's really bad. They're barely taking in territory. They're moving real slow. They could, I mean, they're just inching along. And then when you point out this to them, they'll come back and say, well, that's because the Russians are moving so fast. the Ukrainians don't have time to recover bodies. Which is it? Fast or slow? Okay, pick one, stick with that, and then let your analysis flow. The going slow, that's the male bovine excrement, Ray Moore politely calls it. So you've got that, and then
Larry, quickly, but I don't mean to interrupt, but your mic is cutting out a bit. So I just wanted to point that out. So before you keep going. Sorry. Yeah, sorry about that. Now I can't hear you at all, but I know you're switching things.
No, that won't do it.
Oh, you sound good.
How about that?
Yep. Continue. Sorry.
Okay. Can you hear me now?
I can. There's a little bit of a delay, but continue.
Okay, yeah, you can hear me now. With respect to the oil refineries, right now, the 15% of Russia's GDP is made up from exports of oil and gas. None of that is refined, okay? So they're not losing anything. If blow up a refinery, it doesn't affect Russia's oil, gas exports. That's number one. Number two, Russia refines, it's only using 27% of its oil refinery capability to create gas, gasoline, fuel, and diesel. They've hit some, they've caused some damage. The Ukrainians have caused some damage at some refineries, but they don't have the firepower to destroy any of those refineries. Andrei Martyanov the other day, he took one refinery as an example and explained that to actually destroy it, and he was basing this not on his opinion, but on his training as both a naval officer in the Russian Navy, but as well as someone who's gone through the military academy. It would take 100 Tomahawks to destroy that refinery. Guess what? The United States doesn't even have 100 Tomahawks. And let's say you destroy one refinery. Well, I pointed out Russia's only using 28% of its capacity. That means it has close to 72, 73% that it could turn on. So that's why I say this delusional narrative in the West is leading them to make a variety of false assumptions that will bite them in the rear end.
Yeah, it's Thomas. Talk about the future of Europe then. Where is Europe heading given this dynamic, given the fact that Russia has, for the beginning, said it's preparing for war with NATO, which is essentially Europe with the US at the head of it. And of course, there's this dynamic that you talk about a lot in terms of the conditions that are imposed on Europe based on this incredible attempt to militarize as well as to cut back everything for the population of these countries. And it's almost happening across the board where each country is in lockstep with this under the umbrella of the EU and of course NATO. So what is the future then of Europe? Where is it headed as this world changes significantly? Russia being in command of this war, just one fact on the ground demonstrating this.
Yeah. Well, let's start the more hopeful arguments. And I think there's reason to be hopeful for the future of Europe insofar as we see that despite the insane levels of propaganda, most people, I mean, very large amounts of people across Europe, especially in Western Europe, are not buying the propaganda. Poll after poll in countries like, Italy, Germany, France, the countries of the Mediterranean show that people do not want war with Russia. Obviously, they don't believe Russia to be the number one threat. They've got much more pressing issues, such as putting food on their table, and they've got much more pressing material issues that they would like politicians to address. They don't view Russia as the number one threat. So this, in a way, this gives us reason for hope, in a sense that it shows that it's as crazy as the European political leadership has become. This craziness, hasn't yet infected the masses, at least in Western Europe. Now, in the Baltic countries and in Nordic countries, it's a different affair. But overall, there's they amount of a relatively small number of people, so that's not necessarily a problem. So I think that's a positive sign. They've lost control of the narrative. And just as with Russia, when they see the propaganda not working, all they can think of is to double down on the propaganda, double down on the censorship, under the guise of fighting, Russian disinformation or misinformation. But people are seeing through that now, thanks, of course, to alternative media and whatnot. So that's, in a way, that's positive. I think this is also a key difference with the sort of pre-war period in the previous two world wars. So the kind of mass hysteria that elites were capable of whipping up before those two world wars is not present, and this is also clearly you can clearly be seen in the fact that, as has already been mentioned by Pat and Larry, there's people don't want to go to war. People don't want to fight, especially young people have no desire to go and fight and die for their country. And paradoxically, this is a result of the, in a way, anti-national brainwashing that they've been subjected to at the hands of their national elites and the EU Brussels establishment more in general. They've been told for decades now that to be patriotic, to believe in your country is a bad thing. It's a reactionary thing. It's bordering on fascism. So of course now, after having essentially heavily denationalized people's identities, it's not easy to get them to go and die on the front for their country. So this is kind of the maybe a silver lining of this process of kind of denationalizing and culture that we've seen in Europe. And of course, they haven't been able to build an alternative European identity. So of course, people are even less willing to go and die for Europe, whatever that is, or even less so for the European Union, which is even more delegitimized than the various national elites. So that's one thing to be hopeful about, but more in general, I think of course, the question is, how do we get out of this? It's already been mentioned that war is a possible outcome of all this, and if that is where we're heading, then I don't think there will be a Europe to rebuild, because I think one element that's often left out of all these discussions, whether Europeans are willing to go and fight or not, or even all the discussions about the how European conventional how NATO conventional forces weigh up compared to Russian conventional forces. And we're often told that, in terms of air force, in terms of naval forces, NATO is much more, powerful than Russia. And on a paper, some of that is true. But I think this, all these scenarios operate under the assumption that what we would, a NATO-Russia conflict would play out, would be a war of attrition like the one in Ukraine, just on a bigger scale. But this is insane. This is not, we wouldn't have NATO-Russian forces fighting each other, along a front line. I think this is not how that would play out. I think if it comes to that, then we will see missiles that will start flying on both sides onto, they will be flying into European cities. This is how this ends if an all-out war with Russia breaks out, which is why people should be completely terrified at that prospect, and should realize that Europe's core interest lies in avoiding that scenario at all costs, not in arming for that scenario, because that will make no difference whatsoever. So, if we're able to avoid that scenario, then I think we will still see European elites hanging on to power with their teeth and nails, and so I think we'll still see things get worse in terms of just the political repression, even the outright violence coming from the establishments against these growing dissident movements and dissident parties that we're seeing spring up all across Europe. In some cases, becoming major parties. So I think we'll see more Romania-style interventions in terms of banning political parties, banning political leaders, maybe outright cancelling elections, which produce an outcome that elites don't like. But beyond that, if I think at some point it's clear that if we manage to avoid war, that the system can't hold forever. So, this is clear. No system can survive simply on repression, on lies, on propaganda. This is what dying regimes resort to in the final stages of their life. We've seen this in the past. So I think in a way it's historically clear that we are on the cusp of the of regime change in Europe. It has to come at some point. Now, what we replace that with then remains to be seen. If hopefully the EU peacefully dissolves, then we might be able to build something completely different. I think it's a system that should be built on the national, on reestablishing a degree of national sovereignty for the countries of Europe, which would mean reestablishing a degree of democracy, of people in each country being allowed to determine the fate of their nations. And of course, this should be collaboration on the European level, but it shouldn't be the kind of centralized supranational system that we have today in the European Union. It should be more of an internationalist system, a loose alliance, I would say, based on the model of the BRICS, or even the ASEAN, so loose alliances of sovereign countries which allow for collaboration while leaving space for the cultural and political and distinctiveness of each country. So I think that would be sort of the ideal scenario, but I think we're still quite far from seeing that.
Yeah, great points, Patrick. Thomas. Great points, Thomas. I was getting ahead of myself. Gentlemen, my last segment was going to be about West Asia. Patrick and Thomas, I know you had some time considerations if you two want to head out, that's okay. Just let me know.
If I would, Danny, just one final comment on the Ukraine Russia thing. Thomas made some really important points. One of them I would jump off on. Very important point. He said that Europe's been denationalized, and you can't just drum up that sort of bravado and chauvinism and patriotism to get people to fight, maybe in the way that previous generations could have done. This is so true, and it could be the saving grace of this situation. But the other thing that's missing is during the Cold War, there was this ideological binary, which was communism versus capitalism, or free market versus socialism, whatever. And so that kind of, in the bipolar world, before the Iron Curtain fell, that kind of worked. It kind of made sense. It kind of justified the ideological threat, at least to part of the Western population that bought into saying, yeah, that's something we need to protect against. That's our way of life, our freedoms, and so forth. It had an existential threat vibe to it. They don't have any of that. They haven't got any of these things now. It's pure power politics right now. But as far as Europe's concerned, yes, the only benefit is that you don't have these big national militaries like Germany or Italy. But in the political realm, in politics, somebody has to be blamed, you see. And if missiles do fly, then invariably European populations will be looking at their weak leaders and saying, how did we get to this point? And that's even a bridge too far for our sort of feckless politicians that we have currently at the helm in Europe right now. I just wanted to leave that there. There's so many good angles to segues to jump off on this, but appreciate the conversation today. Great to see you, Larry and Thomas and Danny, as always.
Great to see you.
Awesome talk. See you guys soon.
All right, take care, Patrick. Sorry, Larry, you're muted. Were you saying something?
I just said thanks, Patrick.
Of course, of course. Thomas, are you okay to stay, or what would you like? It's up to you.
He's muted.
Sorry, you were muted.
Oh yeah, sorry. Yeah, if you don't mind, I'll jump off as well. I've just
Okay.
got a bunch of stuff that I have to
No,
finish up.
totally okay. Totally
See,
okay.
I knew I should have showered before coming on because, you know, my lack of cleanliness has driven everyone away.
We can smell you from all the way in Moscow.
Johnson, you stink.
It has been a really great discussion. Really, thank you.
Of
Dan,
course, yeah.
so,
And I'll be sure at the end of the show, both you and Patrick's information is there. So I'll be sure to plug it at the end. Okay.
Okay. Thanks a lot.
All right. I'll
Thanks,
talk to you
Thomas.
soon. Bye. All right, Larry, just me and you, the two musketeers. Let's get into the Middle East then, or West Asia, more appropriately called. So I wanted to talk to you about the situation that we're seeing in West Asia. Now, I wanted to pull up some facts on the ground that are potentially, I want your take, maybe influencing some of the behavior of the Israeli regime and the U.S. backing it. So there's this really interesting story in Haaretz recently about the consequences of Israel's endless genocidal war drive in the region, as the average number of Israeli immigrants have doubled since Netanyahu's return to power. And it says that 82,000 Israelis left in 2023, the year that October 7th, the whole genocide began. And then the same level estimated for 2024, a year plus into that. And they talk about how this is the first time that not only has the number of immigrants doubled, but the number of people returning is actually far less. And then there was this curious, and I think very interesting story that didn't get picked up by anybody except for Iranian media, which is that top commander and brigadier general of the IRGC, Mohammad Reza Naqvi, very vocal often on military affairs in Iran, has said and doubled down on the fact that if a war is going to happen, and if Israel and the United States have any inclinations of such a thing in the near future, that their arsenal, their missile arsenal, has been untouched. And he goes on to say that they failed to even destroy 3% of the missile launchers, let alone drain and deplete the capacity of Iran to fire them. So, Larry, I wanted to ask you, what is the situation actually now with the U.S. and Israel in the region, given that there is this ceasefire, which is not a ceasefire at all? Israel has already broken it many, many, many times and has killed untold number, still probably an undercount number of Palestinians. What is the situation? What's your assessment of this reality on the ground?
Well, Hamas keeps hoping that the ceasefire will hold, but it won't. And I say that because they continue to turn over bodies as they are able to recover them from under the rubble where they were killed by their own side, by Israel. Israel, for its part, is reportedly, well, in fact, there's a general on tape. I heard this secondhand via Ray McGovern, but I have no reason to doubt his word, that this Israeli general was admitting that they're funding these extremist groups in Gaza to carry out attacks both on other Palestinians, to steal food, and to blame it on Hamas, and to actually attack IDF forces in order to create the justification for Israel to restart its offensive. Witkoff and Kushner claim that they're going there to help oversee or ensure the disarmament of Hamas. Hamas will not be disarmed. I mean, Israel's had 2 years and 2 weeks to do it. They have been unable to. Israel had every military advantage you could have. You know, they had the area surrounded. They had it outnumbered. They had armored tanks, armored vehicles, artillery, overhead imagery, aircraft, both fixed wing and rotary wing. There wasn't a single thing Israel didn't have. They had total control over the resupply routes into and out of Gaza. Yet, here we are 24 plus 4 months, 28 months, 29 months later, and they failed. They ultimately failed, or I guess we're not 20, or the 25th month, but Israel failed to disarm Hamas. So the genocide will continue. Israel is going to look for an excuse to start it up again. And Trump will have to move on to some other project because his lasting peace ain't going to last. And despite what I just saw the headline with Witkoff and Kushner, and they say, oh yeah, and JD Vance, oh, it's looking good. There's still hope. It's like that scene from Dumb and Dumber where Jeff Daniels, he plays a goofy character, and he's enamored of this one woman, and he keeps trying to get her to become his romantic partner, and she keeps saying like no and hell no, and he goes like, is there still a chance? And she goes, you know what, if like we were stranded at the North Pole and the end of the world had come, and we had to make love in order to survive the human race, the answer would still be no. And he goes, so there's still a chance. That's where they're at. It's not going to happen because the Zionist settlers are committed to expelling and exterminating the Palestinians. They're not interested in a compromise. They're not interested in taking one portion of land and letting the Palestinians have the other portion of land. They are fully, totally, eternally committed to destroying and eliminating Palestinians from that land which they claim. The Palestinians, for their side of the story, they're not willing to go away. They're not willing to surrender the land that they have lived on well before these settlers ever showed up. Most of them from Europe and the United States. They have no roots there. These Palestinians, in fact, a friend of mine who was, I would have called him sort of marginally pro-Zionist. We talked the other day. He goes, do you realize what the DNA makeup of the Palestinians are? And I said, no, I really haven't looked into it. He said, they've got more Jewish blood in them than the Jews. Oh, he goes, I got to rethink this whole Palestine thing. Yeah, I think you do.
Yeah. Yeah. And then there's the question of restarting a war with Iran that Israel has gotten back and forth with, threatening that it's going to happen, rumblings it's going to happen any minute. And then Netanyahu sending messages through Vladimir Putin saying, no, it's not going to happen. Iran has been very steadfast in saying that not only is it ready for such a war, but now it's coming out with specific details about how ready it is, saying that their missile launchers are 97% plus intact and that they are building upon their indigenous capabilities as we speak. And the nuclear deal now is over. Russia, China, Iran. Iran has communicated to them that it's over, that there is no limitations to Iran's nuclear development. What's your take on this?
Unless Israel is completely suicidal, which I cannot rule out, but I think there are still enough intelligence officers in there with sanity. They can see clearly since June 24th, at the end of hostilities with the United States allowing Iran to hit Al Udeid Air Force Base in Qatar, that Iran, in contrast to pre-June 13th, when Israel launched its surprise attack, Iran is now accepting Chinese and Russian assistance, military assistance in particular. Prior to June 13th, Iran basically had turned down specific offers of Russian help with air defense and other systems. The Iranians were, there's an old television ad from the 60s with about an Excedrin pain reliever, And, a young woman was doing something and her mother tried to help, and she snapped at her, "Mother, please, I'd rather do it myself." Well, that was Iran prior to June 13th. They were telling Mother Russia and Mother China, "Hey, leave us alone. We got it in hand. We got this under control." After June 24th, they went, "You know what? We'd love to have a helping hand." I think they may have rediscovered a copy of Ringo Starr's old song, "I Get By With a Little Help from My Friends," sung by Joe Cocker as well. But there had been a steady flow of Russian and Chinese military airlift, heavy aircraft in and out of Tehran. And the Iranians have been all over both the diplomatic and military front in terms of sending defense chief of the army, chief of the general staff, Larijani, who is a close advisor to the Ayatollah, all to Russia and to Beijing for talks, coordination. So, they're working together. And I think, the United States at least understands that. And that the notion of getting back into a shooting match with Iran would, carry enormous risks for both, not only for Israel, but also for the United States. And I think based on that, I don't think it'll happen. Well, if it does, Iran is going to be in a position to affect the potential destruction of Israel.
Yeah. And yet, Larry, the United States continues to move to the rescue, or at least threaten to move to the rescue to Israel. And I want you to react to this. These comments that J.D. Vance and Jared Kushner revived, right? Wasn't it Donald Trump who said that Kushner will not be part of the administration? Now Jared Kushner is a big part of the administration, a leading face in the Gaza so-called reconstruction plan, also should be better known as the displacement plan. But here is what J.D. Vance had to say about how the U.S. will respond to a failing ceasefire.
Our warning to Hamas is very straightforward. The terms of the 20-point plan that the
I can't hear it.
There is very clear.
Sorry, but
it's supported not just by Israel, but by all of our Gulf.
You're not able to hear that, Larry?
No.
Oh, that's interesting. Okay, well, I'm going to play it, and then I can summarize what he said.
Yeah. Go ahead and play it for your audience. I couldn't hear the others, but I figured that Patrick and them could. Thought it was just me.
All right. Here we go.
Our warning to Hamas is very straightforward. The terms of the 20-point plan that the president put out there is very clear. It's supported not just by Israel, but by all of our Gulf Arab friends. It's that Hamas has to disarm. It's that Hamas has to actually behave itself, and that Hamas, while all the fighters can be given some sort of clemency, they're not going to be able to kill each other, and they're not going to be able to kill their fellow Palestinians. Now, again, that's going to take a little bit of time. We're talking about how to set up the security and humanitarian apparatus to put all this in place. But right now, where I stand, I feel confident that we're going to be in a place where this peace lasts, where it's durable. And if Hamas doesn't cooperate, then as the President of the United States has said, Hamas is going to be obliterated. Steve?
So the big point here through all the flowery commentary, Larry, was if Hamas doesn't comply, then they will be obliterated. Your reaction to this, because we've heard this for 2+ years, and now we have the U.S. saying that it essentially will play some kind of role in that. Your reaction to this?
Yeah, real disappointed to hear J.D. Vance become stupid. I thought he was smarter than that. Okay, good luck. Do it, guys. Stop talking about it. Do it. And the reason they can't do it is in part because Hamas, and it's not just Hamas, there are 13 other Palestinian groups to contend with. They are well entrenched, they are well protected, and any chance to try to go in there and dig them out is going to result in significant casualties for the attacking force. We've been told, we've been fed this line of garbage for too long about how magnificent and tough and Oh, gee, the incredible military capabilities of the Israelis. These Zionists are only good at killing women and children, unarmed people. You know, they're not good with the actually, put them in an even match with somebody who can fire back. They're gonna lose a lot of the time. So it's another meaningless threat by J.D. Vance. Unfortunately, aligns himself with a policy of genocide.
Yeah, and talk about why it's so difficult, Larry. You were in the CIA as you were an analyst. I know the CIA studies these things, resistance and armed insurgency.
Come on, man. Oh, man, you really believe that? You think they study this and think about this analytics?
Well, they at least talk about.
Yeah, they should. They should. Okay, they should. You are correct. They should do that.
But what exactly is it about? Because we've seen this throughout the course of history. The odds against the Palestinians are just absolutely grand, but yet they continue to fight and fight and fight and fight on, to the point where, it is just words. The resistance doesn't go away, no matter how much Israel and the United States at its back pummels it. And then, of course, you have Israel wanting then to expand this to a much bigger foe, which would be Iran. So talk about what is it about, in your estimation, through your experience, what is it that makes it so difficult for Israel to, quote unquote, achieve its goals in this manner?
They are a bunch of arrogant pricks, is the most impolite way I can say it. I do a lot of training for people with firearms to protect themselves. And there are three key elements: knowledge, skill. Skill means you take the knowledge and then you're able to apply it in a pattern that is repeatable and reliable. And then the third is attitude. If you're the type of person, as are the vast majority of these Zionists, we know everything. You can't teach us anything. We are the best. We're the strongest. There's nobody better than us. There's, I guess, another saying from the Old Testament: the pride goeth before the fall. And it is their out of control pride and arrogance which prevents them from being able to actually accomplish what they're claiming that they're doing. They are a classic group of bullies. They beat up on the weak. When confronted with someone with some actual strength, they back down and run away. And so that's why they're hoping the United States will come in here and save their bacon, and the United States will get in there and try to root out the Hamas fighters out of these tunnels. And if the United States does decide to do that, and I don't think they will, they'll be stacking bodies at Dover, Delaware, where the military remains are brought to be cleaned up before being returned to families for burial.
Yeah, and Larry, I wanted your comments on the U.S. and quote-unquote allied support for Israel throughout this so-called ceasefire process. We have reports now of the UK deploying troops to Israel at the Trump administration's request. A small number, an unverified, unmentioned number, so they haven't talked about how many are going. But we already know that the United States has sent 200 troops to Israel to quote-unquote monitor the ceasefire. What exactly is going on? What does it even mean to monitor a ceasefire with militaries of these erstwhile states which are engaged or have been engaged in active overt wars all throughout their history, and of course are engaged in many military conflicts, including this one? So what does this actually mean?
They're going there to help enrich the restaurant industry and to help increase the income of hookers. And I'm not kidding. That's about what they're going to do. What they're going to sit there and go, oh yeah, look, there's a bomb going off, or there's a bullet flying. Just today, the Israelis finally conceded they were initially hollering that there'd been a breach of the ceasefire because 2 or 3 of their soldiers were killed or wounded rolling over an explosive device. Well, it turns out they just were careless. There were no Hamas fighters in the area. It was unspent ordnance, ordnance that had not been detonated yet. And they drove over it and it blew them up. Remember that thing I said about attitude, arrogance, carelessness? Case in point, just another example. I never, it just when I worked at State Department in counterterrorism, my immediate supervisor was a retired Marine colonel who had been in combat twice, 2 times. I mean, 2 different tours, combat tours in Vietnam. And yeah, we lost that one too. But he did a lot with the government of Jordan and Jordan's special forces in his career with the political military bureau at State as well. And he just pointed out, he said, look, the Israelis are not very good. And part of it is because of who they fight. You know what? When you're picking on women and children, if you're out beating up kids in wheelchairs, you may think you are the toughest man in the world. But you're beating up on women and children and kids in wheelchairs. That'd make you tough. And we're seeing that with Israel. Their reputation for military prowess and excellence is way overblown. And there's 2 ways to learn. You can learn the hard way, or you can learn by listening, and they don't like to learn by listening, so they're going to learn the hard way.
Yeah, and they've always relied upon the United States supporting and backing their operations to quote unquote mow the lawn, to wage this kind of counterinsurgency kind of warfare against its allies, assassinations, backing up proxies. But now this is the real deal, Larry. This is getting there. Yeah.
It's called enabling or facilitating genocide.
Yeah, that's exactly. That's what it is. This is the almost like the end game, the genocide leading to the greater Israel, leading to total domination. I guess that must be the fantasy in the minds of people like Ben-Gvir, Netanyahu, and the political class that backs them. But do you see that actually being a realistic outcome out of all of this? Because we're now years into this, of course, since the foundations of Israel, but now we're in this accelerated genocidal moment that is bringing with it all kinds of unforeseen, unintended consequences.
Well, it really depends on a bunch of, I'll call them exterior variables. One is, if the world is faced with a global financial crisis that hits the United States particularly hard, then the ability of the United States to continue to fund and support Israel will be called into question. It's not that much money, but it's enough money that in a time of fiscal crisis, US might decide, hey, we can't afford this anymore. That's one element. Another element is if Israel's foolish enough to attack Iran. I think Iran's got the capability and the missile diversity and the technological advantage with the missiles to make Israel disappear. Israel also could be tempted to use a nuclear device that would kill a bunch of people in one location, but then would turn Israel into a pariah and an object of attack by a whole number of other countries. So Israel, their best way out right now is to negotiate a settlement with Hamas, to accept the 2-state solution, and then to begin pouring their energies into diplomacy as opposed to arming soldiers that don't want to fight.
Yeah, and then your final comments on the U.S. side. How do you see this shaking up for the United States? Because we've gone through major swings. We've gone through Trump administration pouring in the support, the constant backing of Israel, leading up to what almost ended up being a full-scale war with Iran. Now we're in this period where it's almost as if the Trump administration is trying to find a new place to focus on, whether it's Venezuela, whether it's the trade reigniting failing trade war, but West Asia, the ceasefire seems to be an attempt to kind of put lipstick on a pig and then put that pig back in the barn, but doesn't seem like that's possible. So what's your assessment of where this is going to go for the United States? Your thoughts?
Yeah, U.S. is in a very similar situation to Europe, where there is a wide gulf, a distancing taking place between the leadership and the people. The majority of Americans are increasingly turning against Israel, not endorsing Israel. And then the United States financial situation is not exactly stellar. And neither is that any of it in Europe. So what you have in Europe right now is this small political class at the top wanting to, embrace Israel. And in many cases, because of the money that's involved, that they think that Israel will pay them based upon loans that have been made. But then the majority of the population don't hold those views. They just as soon rush the bank and burn it. So to the extent that our leadership in this country continue to move in lockstep in the same direction with respect to the support of the war in Ukraine, or support of the genocide in Palestine, or support for a war with Iran, then it will lead to our own destruction, I guess is what I'm saying.
Yeah, no, indeed. All right, well, everyone, this was a great show. Larry, thanks for sticking around with me for a bit longer here. I just want to make sure everybody knows that our guests who were here before in the first 2/3 of this segment. What's that say?
Russia's shirt.
Nice. Yes, Larry's joining us directly from Russia. Everyone, be sure I have Larry Johnson's YouTube channel, Countercurrents, in the video description. Patrick Henningsen's Substack, as well as 21st Century Wire YouTube is there too. And then Thomas Fazi's Substack can also be found, so you can check out their work after the show is over. Make sure you hit the like button before you do that, because that helps boost the stream and the algorithm after we are done here. I want to thank everyone for giving a super chat, to Nadia for giving 2, and then for Ron Kiddo for giving 3, making comments before this show even started. So I also appreciate your support. Sorry I can't get to those comments in terms of timing, but there will be more. They're also in the video description, all the places to find and support my work from Patreon, Substack, and so much more. All the support is appreciated. With all that said, Larry and I will sign off together here. Everyone take care. I'll let you know when the next show is. Until then, bye-bye.
And Dan,